The other day, a package arrived in the mail, which I was very excited to receive. It's this massive, wonderful The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell, which I'm going to try to read this month, the month of July, with a few other booktubers. I'm getting a bit of a head start because even taking a whole month for this book is going to be a big exertion on my part. This will be a reread for me, but I'm excited to go through it more carefully than I did the first time. Before Boswell begins this massive biography of Samuel Johnson, he gives a kind of an introduction where he gives some thoughts on his methodology in writing this biography, how he thinks about the project of biography. Quote, "Biography has often been allotted to writers who seem very little acquainted with the nature of their task or very negligent about the performance. They," meaning normal, non-Boswell type biographers, "rarely afford any other account than might be collected from public papers, but imagine themselves writing a life when they exhibit a chronological series of actions or preferments and have so little regard to the manners or behaviors of their heroes, that more knowledge may be gained of a man's real character by a short conversation with one of his servants than from a formal and studied narrative, begun with his pedigree and ended with his funeral." So there you have Boswell criticizing the standard biography, which is very dry. And of course, this is not that kind of dry biography. This is a very personal biography filled with little personal anecdotes and conversations. Skipping a paragraph here, Boswell continues with how he writes his biography. Quote, "I am fully aware of the objections which may be made to the minuteness on some occasions of my detail of Johnson's conversation, and how happily it is adapted for the petty exercise of ridicule by men of superficial understanding and ludicrous fancy. But I remain firm and confident in my opinion that minute particulars are frequently characteristic and always amusing when they relate to a distinguished man. I am therefore exceedingly unwilling that anything, however slight, which my illustrious friend thought it worth his while to express with any degree of point, should perish." And then he goes on to quote a noted Jewish commentator, Rabbi David Kimchi, who explains the passage that even the idle talk of a good man ought to be regarded. The most superfluous things, he saith, are always of some value. End quote. And so there are a few things that are very interesting to me about that introduction. One is that Boswell knows that he's opening himself up to ridicule. He has enough insight to see that what he's doing is strange, the minuteness of this biography. But what I think is interesting is that he doesn't really seem to understand the main thrust of the criticism that he's opened himself up to. Certainly, people might criticize the minuteness of his detail, but there are other things that are strange about this biography. I would argue much stranger. The most glaring thing in this biography is that Boswell seems to have this compulsion to insert himself into every scene. It's not just a biography of Johnson because Boswell is such a main character in this book. There's hardly a quote, an opinion of Johnson that he can relate, that he doesn't add some commentary on or criticize. Another thing which I find very interesting about this introduction, and it's characteristic of Boswell throughout the book. Throughout the book, Boswell acts, he talks like he's writing a hagiography. He talks like he's writing this Lives of the Saints, of the brilliant, brilliant Dr. Johnson. And of course, that's part of what he's doing, obviously. But he's also engaging in something a little bit less seemly, a little bit more controversial, because he's fascinated with the things that make Johnson so strange and so eccentric. And he loves undercutting Johnson and talking about all the ways in which Johnson is wrong. And so he does sort of this double play here, this dishonest, duplicitous move where he pretends like this is pure veneration, but in practice it's very critical and it has sort of like a tabloid-esque feel to it. Like even the great venerated Dr. Johnson is a strange guy. And so what is this book? What do we make of this book? What's so fascinating is the juxtaposition between these two characters. We learn from Boswell's notebooks, biographers who have written about Boswell, that he was kind of this like roguish character. He was engaged in all sorts of debauchery and chasing after women. And he links up with this guy who's like this towering moralist, this man of letters, celebrated man of letters. And they couldn't be more different. And they form this strange relationship, this unusual relationship, which is filled with tension and at times almost breaks down. At times it almost doesn't survive. But despite their obvious differences, they seem to share a kind of darkness. And this is one of the things that really attracts me to this book, and I really enjoy in this book. They both seem to struggle with what Boswell calls melancholy, which is like this sort of depression, a sense of listlessness and purposelessness. It makes it hard for them to get out of bed in the morning at different times. Boswell is obsessed with death and is constantly questioning Johnson about death, and Johnson is terrified of death. And so they have this sort of these demons that they seem to be wrestling with throughout the book. The darker elements of their psychology and their personality. There's a quote from The Life of Johnson that I was reminded of when reading the introduction to this Penguin Classic version, because it was brought down. And I think it's a very characteristic quote. Boswell and Johnson are talking together. Quote, "A moth, having fluttered round the candle and burnt itself, he," that is Johnson, "laid hold of this little incident to admonish me, saying with a sly look and in a solemn but quiet tone, that creature was its own tormentor, and I believe its name was Boswell." End quote. And so I find that quote so characteristic because it highlights this strange relationship between the moralizing figure of Johnson, who forms this like legitimate but also unusual friendship with this like eager pupil in Boswell who's the scribe writing down every word, and a fascination with the torments of psychology, the way we torment ourselves and each other. And in this strange context, in this strange relationship, and this super strange biography that defies categorization, you have this meeting of these two people who are so different, but they form a real friendship. And despite their differences, they're both brilliant in their own way. And they both contribute to what I think is the deep elements of wisdom in the book. Thanks for watching.